Board President of the World Affairs Council of Western Massachusetts. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here today for today's program featuring Michael Klare on All Hell Breaking Loose, the Pentagon's Perspective on Climate Change. I want to first thank the sponsors of our Instant Issues programs, Glen Meadow, the organization that is dedicated to supporting seniors in many ways, also to Greenfield Savings Bank, and especially to the trust officers inside the Wealth Management and Trust Services division who really are responsible for getting us the support for this. And good folks. I hope at one of our upcoming events we can have some representatives from the Trust Department. They really are nice people. Also, thanks to Sir Speedy, who does all of our printing for us, and the Wilbraham and Munson Academy, who is so good at bringing young people to our events. And special thanks to NAA Plotkin, who are the managers here of 1350 Main Street, the Mass Live building, who make this room available to us and support us throughout the year in many different ways. I also want to thank Jeremy Cole in the back, a board member who is videoing our event today. And special thanks to John and Meg Young, who were out registering us all as we came in today. And thanks, as always, to our Executive Director, Sid Melcher, for all of her work in making today possible. We're pleased to continue partnering with Valley Eye Radio, which will be broadcasting a recording of this program for their listeners with vision and print disabilities. Today is the 94th anniversary of our very first World Affairs program. It was held at the Hotel Worthy in 1926, and it featured a debate between a Harvard professor and a business executive from New York, debating about the dangers of the rise of fascism in Italy, with one of those people saying this was in fact a grave danger, and the other person actually saying not so much. But that's 94 years of good programming from the World Affairs Council. On that happy note, let me introduce today's speaker. He's a longtime member and friend of the council, Michael Klare, the Five College Professor Emeritus of Peace and World Security Studies and Director of the Five College Program in Peace and World Security Studies. He's written widely on U.S. military policy, international peace and security affairs, global arms trade, and global resource politics. His articles have appeared in many journals, including Arms Control Today, Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, Current History, Foreign Affairs, Harper's, The Nation, Scientific American, and Technology Review. He's published numerous books, including Resource Wars, Blood and Oil, and Race for What's Left. And he will be speaking to us today about his latest book, All Hell Breaking Loose, the Pentagon's Perspective on Climate Change, which we have for sale here, and you can get signed before you leave, thanks to the Odyssey Bookshop. So please join me in welcoming Michael Klare.
Can you hear me okay? Good. Hello, everybody. A pleasure to see all of you today. Thank you so much for coming. First, I just want to say I'm a huge supporter of the World Affairs Council in general because I believe in citizen education on world affairs. I think it's terribly important in a democracy like ours, especially at this time, that people be well informed about world affairs and participate in that conversation. And I especially want to celebrate the World Affairs Council of Western Massachusetts for their good work over the years. 94 years, that's very impressive. So terrific work, you all. And I am a strong supporter and hope to continue to meet with you folks as long as I possibly can. So my topic is, I want to talk about my book for 15 or 20 minutes and then take questions, because I know you're going to have a lot of questions. So my theme is the military's perspective on climate change. So let me begin with this. One of the first things that Donald Trump did when he became president of the United States was to rescind an executive order that the previous president Mr. Obama had initiated early on in his administration. I won't read out the number of it, but it was an executive order that required all executive branches of the U.S. government, every department of the U.S. government, to identify its vulnerability to the impacts of climate change and to take whatever action was necessary to build resilience to climate change and to mitigate its impacts, its contribution to climate change. Every agency was required to move swiftly to address the climate change danger. So one of the first things that President Trump did was to rescind that measure. And he ordered all federal agencies to stop work on climate change, to stop doing anything to mitigate the impacts of climate change or to prepare for the impacts of global warming, to pretend it didn't exist. Now, at that time, and since then, most federal agencies have carried out his instructions to the letter. They have stopped talking about, they have purged mention of climate change from their websites, from their publications, their speeches, and have stopped doing anything. One federal agency has more or less resisted this demand, the U.S. Department of Defense. Quietly, without making a big fuss about it, the U.S. Department of Defense has continued to take action to prepare for the effects of climate change and to actually reduce its contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. It's gone on exactly as it had under the Obama administration. It has stopped talking about climate change. It uses euphemisms like extreme weather, changing weather, extreme storm activity, but nonetheless, it has continued to address the dangers posed by the effects of climate change. So I find this extremely interesting. The Department of Defense is the biggest federal agency, is the largest employment in the U.S. government, and it's obviously a very important organization. What explains that? That is what my book essentially is about. And so why is this? Why is the Department of Defense continuing to address the climate danger? Well, there are a number of reasons for this. And that's what I will speak about for 10, 15 minutes. But let me be very clear as I go into this that the Department of Defense is not an environmental organization. It's not doing this out of concern, for endangered species or endangered habitats. It's not coming at this from an environmentalist perspective. You'll see none of that literature, nor is it coming at it from the point of view that, there are bad guys in this and we have to go after the bad guys. If you watched the debates last night, you know that many of the Democratic candidates say that we have to go after the fossil fuel producers and the like. That's not their perspective. They have a very distinctive perspective of their own. And this comes from how they see the world, the dangers facing the United States, and their role in addressing those dangers. So, from the perspective of the U.S. Department of Defense and the military services, their outlook is very clear. The greatest dangers facing the United States of America at this point is the threat posed by a rising China, a more militant and threatening Russia, and then followed that North Korea and Iran. And they see their primary function, above all else, is to prepare for the possibility of conflict with those four countries. And if you read the Department of Defense budget, which was released last week for the coming year, it begins with that language. We are faced by a growing threat from Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, and we have to devote all our resources to addressing those threats. They're very clear about that. But they also say in their literature that anything that stands in the way of preparing for those dangers also constitutes a threat to national security. And climate change falls under that category. From their perspective, climate change is an impediment to defending the United States against conventional enemies like Russia and China. And why is that? They've given a lot of thought to this. Climate change poses a threat to their ability to carry out their functions, their sworn responsibility to defend the nation against foreign threats. Why is that? There are three reasons why they see climate change as an impediment to the functioning of their services. Three of them. The first one is the impact on the global environment. They see, and a lot of senior officers have served multiple tours of duty in Afghanistan and Iraq, in the Middle East, some in Africa, some in Asia, and they have seen firsthand the impacts on climate change in those areas where they have been deployed. And they have seen how those areas are extremely vulnerable to drought, to rising seas, to extreme storms, to water and food insecurity. And those conditions are creating increased instability, to conflict, to ethnic wars throughout Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, making their job harder and harder. And as they see it, they call climate change a threat multiplier. If you have a country, let's say Nigeria or Pakistan, places that they worry about, places like that, where you have countries that are divided along ethnic and religious lines, where water is scarce, where people are fighting over water rights and land, and where the state government, the national government, is corrupt or controlled by one faction and not others, and where resources are scarce. Climate change is multiplying all of those risks by drying up water, making water and food scarce, forcing tribes to fight with one another for the water that's left, and some creating the conditions of state collapse, of chaos, of mass migrations that are flooding into Europe, creating disorder there, as you're well aware, creating mass starvation, creating pandemics like the kinds we're seeing now in China. All of these are going to be multiplied. And they fear that all of this is going to result in more and more tasks for the U.S. military to go and provide order, stability, emergency assistance in those places. They worry, for example, in particular about Pakistan. Pakistan is a nuclear-armed state. You know, people worry about Iran. Yes, Iran has dangers. Iran possesses no nuclear weapons, thanks to the nuclear treaty that President Obama negotiated. Pakistan probably has 100 or more nuclear weapons. Its government is weak. The military controls those nuclear weapons. Some of those military officers have ties to radical extremists, Islamic extremists. The country depends on one source of water, the Indus River. That river is going to disappear for long stretches of time because of climate change. It's going to probably, this is the military's fear, create the breakdown of Pakistan, mass conflict and chaos, and those nuclear weapons falling into the hands of jihadists, perhaps, or rogue elements of the military, and they're going to be called in to provide stability to prevent a nuclear catastrophe or the loss of nuclear weapons to jihadists, and that this is going to suck up all of their capacity when they feel they should be preparing for war with, as I say, with China or Russia. So that's one fear that they have, that climate change will create global chaos, instability, and war that will divert them from what they worry about most. The second concern that they have is that the American homeland is going to be under ever-increasing assault from climate change. Now, I don't have to tell you that we're seeing an increase in extreme storms. This is an expected consequence of climate change, and it's accelerating. The number of extreme storms has multiplied in the 2000s because the oceans are warming, and the hotter the oceans are, the more energy is poured into hurricanes and typhoons, and as a result, every hurricane is going to be more intense, more destructive, more flooding. This is occurring when sea level rise is also accelerating. So floods, when they occur on coastlines, are going to inundate more area, create more destruction, destroy more infrastructure. At the same time, the west of the United States is drier and hotter and more prone to fires. I think I don't have to explain this to you. The middle of the country and the southeast is getting drenched by more and more rain. This is also a product of climate change because it creates more moisture in the air, more moisture in the air, more rain, more flooding. We're seeing this right at this moment in Mississippi and other states in the southeast. We saw it last spring in the Mississippi Valley. So all of this is very, they're fully aware of this. Why does this matter? Under normal circumstances, local civilian authorities are responsible to address these disasters. But they can see that the disasters are going to increase more frequently, going to be more extreme, occur simultaneously, and local authorities are going to be overwhelmed, and then the military will be called in to address the situation and to supplement local authorities and to provide more and more services. That is, to provide policing, food delivery, power delivery. Now, we've already seen this in October 2017 when there was the triple assault of hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, and within weeks of each other. One putting Houston had more rain than any other city in America in American history, creating utter chaos. All of local infrastructure was shut down. Local authorities couldn't cope. The military was called in to supply tens of thousands of military servicemen and women to supplement local authorities in addressing that situation. Then came Irma in Florida, which did a lot of damage there, but then came Maria, which utterly devastated Puerto Rico, and essentially for 6 months, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was the government, was providing services that the government normally provides. This is not the job that the military sees itself doing, but they believe that as the climate warms, that there'll be more instances like that occurring simultaneously, one after the other. So while they're going to be called to more Pakistan's-like situations, at the same time they're going to be called in to do more emergency services at home. At the same time, and here's the third problem, their own basing infrastructure is extremely vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Why is this? It's especially true, of course, for the Navy. But in general, a large portion of America's military basing infrastructure is located on the East Coast, along the coast, and on the West Coast. This is historically true because we fight our wars in Europe and the Middle East from the East Coast, from bases there, and on the West Coast to fight wars in the Pacific. So up and down the East Coast, we have air bases, military and naval bases, and the like. Every one of those bases along the East Coast is going to be flooded and inundated in the coming decades. Some of them are going to be lost entirely. One example is Norfolk Naval Station. This is the largest naval base in the world. It is the home port for the largest number of American aircraft carriers and cruisers, destroyers, and the like. It is at sea level now, a few feet above sea level. It's sinking because it's built on mud flats in the Chesapeake Bay. It's sinking. And sea level rise of 2 or 3 feet, which is expected in the coming decades, will flood that base entirely. To defend it is going to cost in the hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars, or they're going to have to replace it entirely. The Navy understands this totally. They know that their bases are completely vulnerable to climate change and all will have to be replaced. So they understand that this is an existential threat to their ability to carry out their assigned responsibilities to defend the nation. Same thing is true on the West Coast. There the danger is fire. Their bases up and down the West Coast are adjacent to those firestorms that we've read about. Some have been attacked by fire in the past few years, and they're at great risk. Vandenberg Air Force Base, a major missile location, was attacked by one of the fires that you've read about and barely escaped mass destruction 2 years ago or 3 years ago. So they understand that their capacity to carry out their responsibilities in the future will become increasingly compromised. So you add up those 3 threats that they see, overseas chaos and conflict and mass disorder, increasing threats to the homeland, and the vulnerability and destruction of their own facilities at home, and they see in the future what I call an all hell breaking loose scenario where their ability to carry out their fundamental responsibilities will evaporate completely. And hence, they see climate change as a fundamental threat to the national security of the United States because it will make it impossible for them to do what they think is their primary task of defending the nation. Hence, they are quietly continuing to carry out the Obama executive order, which requires them to prepare their bases and facilities for the effects of climate change. They're quietly taking steps like building seawalls around, these are Band-Aids, but it's all they can do, build seawalls around air bases that are at sea level, military facilities that are at sea level, to move facilities on bases that are closest to the coast further inland, to harden their facilities for hurricanes and that sort of thing. They're calling this all preparation for extreme weather and the like. They don't use the term climate change, but they're siphoning money that they would rather spend on bombs and missiles to addressing the climate threat. And they continue to see mitigating climate change effects as a responsibility to reduce their own emissions. So the military services are on a fairly significant scale eliminating their fossil fuel sources of energy for their bases, with eliminating those and replacing them with renewable sources of energy, building vast solar arrays in particular replacing their old gas guzzler trucks and cars, the non-military vehicles, with hybrids and all-electric cars, and reducing the fuel consumption of their military vehicles and ships and planes. All of this is going on at a time when the commander-in-chief said climate change doesn't exist and you shouldn't be paying attention to it. So I find this extremely important that the public be aware of what they think about climate change, what they're doing about it. And I also believe that their analysis of what we face in the future should be more widely disseminated to the public. And it's for that reason that I wrote this book. And I'm speaking to folks like you and traveling around the country raising these issues. And I think I'll stop there and invite you to ask questions about anything that I said or anything related to this topic. I saw your hand first, please. I just needed.
I was just wondering whether FEMA could have more of a role, or they're just under-equipped to come in with the floods and the fires and things like that.
Well, FEMA does a great job. They could do more, but they don't have, you know, thousands of helicopters, planes, water amphibious vehicles at their command. Only the U.S. military has that kind of capacity, like they did in Puerto Rico. FEMA was not able to address the magnitude of the danger, of the after effects of Hurricane Maria. Only the Army Corps of Engineers was able to come in and replace the entire electric grid. Please, and then I'll get everybody.
So if
Could you
Trump
speak
gets
a little louder,
reelected-
please?
If Trump gets reelected, do you think that the government, let me see, in terms
I'll repeat the question. Yeah.
will there be enough money, and will the Defense Department realistically be able to carry out an ability to do this, preventing the disasters from climate change at bases, et cetera, if indeed Trump gets another 4 years and, you know, restricts funds to do such?
So the question is, if Trump gets reelected, will the Pentagon continue to continue along the path that I described? You know, it's hard for me to predict anything. There are two things that make me believe, yes, it'll continue. One is that the bases that the military needs to fight China in particular are in the Pacific are at extreme risk. Many of them, like Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, Guam, all those bases, many of them are atolls or very low-lying, and they're not going to be available to the military in the future. They know that. So if they're going to fight China, they need bases that they could count on that are protected from sea level rise, and they're going to have to find the money one way or the other to protect them. Otherwise, they can't fight China effectively. So they're going to have to lobby somehow, whatever it takes. That's one thing. The other thing is that many of the military bases that are at extreme risk in Florida, in Virginia, in South Carolina, in San Diego, are in places that are represented by Republicans in Congress. And those bases are, the work that's done on those bases by civilian and military personnel, those people live in surrounding communities. And those communities are equally at risk from the same consequences. So when Norfolk Naval Station floods, so does Norfolk and every town around it, and the people can't get to work. The roads are flooded. So you have, and people's homes are flooded. So there's a rising consciousness In those communities, Virginia Beach is a very good example near Norfolk. It's a Republican represented district, but the people there are so worried about climate change that Republicans in these districts are beginning to join Democrats in Congress to press for more action on climate change, and that's going to grow. I saw your hand.
We're not unique in the world in facing this. I mean, China's building all of these bases in the South China Sea that they're going to be flooded. How are other countries' military approaching? Is there an awareness there, and are they reacting, responding?
I've read, the question is, how are other militaries responding? I know that the UK military has thought about this, the German military, but I don't know what they're doing about it. It's a very good question. What I can say is that the US military understands that they cannot tackle this question alone, so that they actually have a program of climate resiliency cooperation with other militaries around the world. And they don't, you have to search for this, but it's there. So the Southern Command, which covers the Caribbean, has been working with the Caribbean islands and Central American countries to prepare for climate emergencies in various ways and provide them with money to build emergency facilities. It's hard to get the specifics around that, but they see that this is a necessary task that they have to carry out. I think if there's a change in the White House, I think you'd see a lot more of this intermilitary cooperation on climate change. Back there, and then I'll get you, okay? Please.
A lot of the work of the Defense Department is done through contractors.
Could you start again, please?
A lot of the work of the Defense Department is done through contractors. Now, are they co-opting the contractors in their view of the climate change, or what are they telling the contractors in terms of climate change?
What are they telling the
Contractors.
contractors? Under the measures that were adopted in the final year of the Obama administration and which have not yet been rescinded, but that's an interesting question. So there are two dimensions to that. One is base construction. So all new bases, facilities, not new bases, but new buildings and facilities have to be address the climate danger. If they're in a hurricane zone, they have to be hardened for more extreme winds. If they're on a coastal area, they have to be moved away from the most low-lying areas further inland. If any new building that has sensitive electrical equipment has to be placed in a coastal area, has to be placed on the second story or above, not on the first story. This is written into the codes that the contractors have to address. Another dimension of this is heat. The scientists are saying that the Persian Gulf area, the Middle East, temperatures in the coming decades are going to average in summer times 120 degrees Fahrenheit day after day after day during daytime. And humans cannot stand much of that. But we expect our soldiers to go out with 60 pounds of gear and body armor, and to fight and walk and patrol in 110, 120 degree weather. This is lethal. You die from that. So, and helicopters cannot operate, current helicopters cannot operate in those temperatures. So they are not talking about this a lot, but they are trying to figure out how our American forces are going to fight in the Middle East if we're required to do so under those conditions. And they're looking at new kinds of gear, you know, lighter gear, heat reflecting, and how to make helicopters more capable of operating in high temperatures. Now, some of this has conceivable civilian use that might be helpful for other people. But yes, contractors are required to address these concerns. Yes, please.
Often when issues become common knowledge, we find that the Defense Department, because they have such deep pockets, has actually been doing research on one issue or another for decades. Can you tell us a little bit about if there's a history of the Defense Department either initiating or contracting research on climate change?
So the question is, has the Pentagon have a history of research on this? The answer is yes. And you know, it's interesting, I didn't talk about the Arctic. I could spend all afternoon talking about the Arctic, because the biggest visible, or the most important dramatic impact of climate change is in the Arctic. The melting of the Arctic ice cap and the rapid increase, the temperatures in the Arctic are rising twice as fast, and it has multiple consequences, including altering our weather down here, among other things. The US Navy, in particular, has been paying a lot of attention to this and doing a lot of research on climate change impacts on the Arctic. Why? Because in the past, they had no responsibilities up there. You couldn't send a ship up there, and nobody else could. Now, the Arctic is becoming an area of global geopolitical contestation, and oil companies are going up there to drill. And so the Navy now has a responsibility to defend a new ocean. That's the way they describe it. We have a new ocean to worry about. So they're doing a lot of Arctic research, for example. And this began in the first decade of this century. The oceanographer of the Navy was one of the leaders in this. And you're going to find this odd, but the Navy has something called Task Force Climate Change. And its focus has been especially on the Arctic, but other factors. So yes, but their biggest interest is they're not scientists per se. So they're more interested in how climate change is affecting the environments in which they will have to serve. And so it's more sociological research than, you know, scientific research. And it's what I was talking about before. How does a country like Nigeria, which is one they're interested in. Nigeria is the biggest contribution to peacekeeping forces in Africa. It's an oil producer. It's a big country. It impinges on all of Africa. And they're looking at how climate change is affecting the internal stability of that country. And they are scared by what they see. The whole northern part of Nigeria is drying out. Lake Chad, which borders on Nigeria, is disappearing. Hundreds of thousands of people have been forced to migrate further south into the middle parts of Nigeria. This is why Boko Haram is feeding off of this, and they worry about terrorism. So if you worry about Boko Haram and you go back, that's where they find climate change. It's fascinating to me. Was there please?
So how does this play out internally with, I assume that at the bureaucratic level in the DOD, they're aware of this and they're working what they can to deal with it. How about the Joint Chiefs of Staff? Do they ever, are they aware? Do they support it? Do they have the President's ear? ever? Is there any chance?
So, there's a new Secretary of Defense. To what degree he's been briefed on this? He's only been in the job a few months. I don't know. Jim Mattis, his predecessor, was thoroughly involved in climate change, has impacts. He testified about this, and I found a document that he commissioned on future threats to American security when he was a lower-ranking officer, which lists climate change and water scarcity, food scarcity, and mass migrations among the greatest threats. So Mattis was certainly very well versed in these threats. What the Joint Chiefs of Staff say about this at this moment, I just don't know the answer to that. But the people who are one level below, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Installations has testified recently about climate change specifically. Yes, when asked a question, Elizabeth Warren has been particularly good about this. And the Senate Armed Services Committee, is climate change impinge on your responsibilities for, yes, is the answer. Yes, we have a very severe problem with climate change. We're doing whatever we can. This is an answer to somebody else's question about hardening the facilities. So at that level, yes. Please.
We all know people, individuals that are deciding to ride on trains instead of airplanes.
Yes.
And I'm wondering about the Air Force and Naval Air, if they're aware or if they're able to make any moves to decrease the amount of fuel they're using in the air.
Well, the former Secretary of the Navy, Ray Mabus, commissioned something called the Great Green Fleet in 2016, which was partly fueled by alternative fuels. So they seek to reduce the fuel consumption of their equipment, but also exploring various kinds of non-fossil fuels, algae fuels in particular. I mean, they're investing in this. So they're they're very much aware. And, in my book, I have citations to the research they're doing on this. So it's a good reason to get my book. Is a lot of this is, a lot of what I said comes from publicly available documents that are online that the various Pentagon agencies have released, but it's not like they're on tables in airport lounge. You know what I mean? They're you have to do some searching for them because they're meant for internal use. They're not secret. They're public. There's something called the Strategic Sustainability Performance Plan, the SSPP, that lays out in extreme, in total detail what each base is doing to reduce its fossil fuel consumption. And you could find this, but they don't hand them out, is what I'm saying. But you could find it, and I have citations to those. Yes, please.
Two parts, if I may. Number one, to what do you attribute, you said a very succinct, clear vision of what you see is going to happen in the future, what the DOD thinks is going to happen in the future. There's counter arguments to that. Trump took away what Obama had in there, so he obviously sees a different scenario than you do. To what do you attribute that view? And secondly, what's your optimistic view of the future? Leave us with some optimism.
I'm not good at optimism. We'll see what happens in the November election, because a lot will hinge on that, to be perfectly honest. So what was the first part of it?
There is a counter view to yours. People have, the
Yes.
sincere, the people who have not resisted what he has come out with, they obviously see something different than you do. What is their argument?
So there's a range to that. I would say the principal argument, counter argument is, well, maybe this will happen. Maybe these things will happen. There's some uncertainty about the science, and the costs of transitioning are so great that we should wait until the uncertainties are resolved. And General Sullivan answered to that, he was the Chief of Staff of the Army, his answer to that is, if you wait for uncertainties to be resolved, you're dead. That's what he says. In war, you have to operate on what looks most likely, and take action to protect yourself and to the safety of your troops. And climate change looks to me like something that's very highly likely to occur, more than almost anything else. So we can't wait for the last 5% or 1% to be resolved. That's his answer. But the counter argument is that there is this 1%, 1% of uncertainty, and because the costs of transition are so high, we should wait.
All right. I think we probably have to bring it to close there, but I want to have all thank Professor Klare for this very, very very thought-provoking
Thank
and
you all for your questions.
right. And just as a token of our appreciation for being here, we'd like to share a book with you that one of our other speakers has done called Barrio Rising by Alejandro Velasco. He spoke to us about the situations in Venezuela, and I suspect he wasn't a lot more optimistic than you. So thank you, folks, for being with us today. And again, I commend to you, if you're interested, the material that's out on the table. We don't hand them out in airports, but we do have interesting information that's on the table as you leave. So thank you all for being here.